He never told her who he was. Every Sunday morning he found her car parked by the diner, left with a list of little things that needed fixing. He never left a note, never asked for thanks. He just fixed it and disappeared, until one morning she didn't leave a list. She left a ring. If you believe in quiet love, in sacrifices made in silence, and in the kind of romance that grows in the cracks of everyday life, this is a story you won't forget. Before we dive in, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from? The garage smelled like oil, old rubber, and rusted dreams. Its flickering fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a pale glow over concrete floors stained with years of hard work. At the far end of the shop, near a shelf lined with worn-out manuals and mismatched tools, a man stood hunched over the hood of an aging pickup, sleeves rolled up, fingers stained with grease. His name was Mason, late 30s, maybe early 40s. No one asked, and he didn't offer. He was the kind of man who kept his stories to himself, not out of pride, but because he didn't think anyone was really listening. The ring of the old landline phone echoed from the back office. He didn't move. He never did when it rang. It was always a missed part, a late bill, or someone canceling last minute. Life had taught him not to expect good news. Outside, the sun was fading behind a curtain of gray, rain just beginning to tap against the metal roof. Mason wiped his brow with the back of his hand, then leaned in closer, listening to the subtle whir of the engine. Every vehicle had its own language. Most people didn't hear it, didn't care to. But Mason did. He could hear when a bolt was too tight. He could feel when the belt tension was off by a breath. Cars didn't lie. People did. There was an old photo taped to the toolbox drawer, a woman with soft eyes and a little girl beside her, maybe 5 or 6, smiling. Sun in their faces. Mason looked at it once, quickly, then shut the drawer with his knee. Not today. He didn't go home to anyone, just a small apartment above the diner on Main. Nights were quiet, sometimes too quiet. But the silence didn't bother him. What got to him were the moments when he wished he had someone to share it with, someone who'd notice if he didn't come home, someone who'd ask how his day went, even if it was the same as the day before. The truck engine gave a soft hum, finally falling into rhythm. Mason nodded once, satisfied. He reached for a rag, wiped his hands, and stood back. No applause, no thanks, just another car, another day. But tomorrow was Tuesday, and Tuesdays were different. The first time she pulled in, Mason barely looked up. Just another clunky engine crawling into the lot at closing time, headlights flickering, bumper held together with hope and duct tape. It was a tired blue sedan, the kind that had been through too many winters, too many cheap repairs, and not enough care. The engine stuttered once before cutting off completely, steam rising faintly from under the hood. She stepped out slowly, like someone who had gotten used to disappointment. Her coat was oversized, swallowed her frame. Her hair was tucked beneath a knit hat, and when she looked at him, really looked at him, her eyes were dark, rimmed with the kind of fatigue you don't get from lack of sleep. She didn't say much, just stood there, hands stuffed into her pockets, staring down at the gravel as if it might open up and swallow her. "Engine overheated?" Mason asked, wiping his hands on a rag as he walked toward her. She nodded, barely. He wanted to ask more, how long it had been acting up, how far she'd driven, what had brought her out this late. But something about her stopped him, not fear, not even sadness. It was the way she stood, like she didn't expect help, didn't want to owe anyone, like she was used to fixing things herself until they completely fell apart. He popped the hood without asking for her name. Every week after that, she came. Same time, same spot. Sometimes it was the brakes, other times it was the radiator, a tire low on air, a battery that wouldn't hold a charge. Always something, always just enough to get her to come back. She never scheduled, never called ahead, just rolled in, quiet as dusk. And every week Mason fixed it. They spoke in short sentences. Her voice was soft, guarded. She'd thank him, hand him a coffee or a piece of fruit wrapped in a napkin. Small things, never money. He never asked for any. Some nights she'd sit on the edge of the lot while he worked, arms wrapped around her knees, staring at the road like she was waiting for something or someone that never came. He didn't ask, she didn't tell, but something unspoken settled between them, like two strangers trying to keep from drowning, just treading water in the same quiet storm. The fourth Tuesday it happened. Mason had just slid beneath the chassis when he heard her car crunch onto the gravel. He didn't get up. He recognized the sound of that engine now, the uneven sputter, the familiar hiss from the cracked manifold. Her sedan rolled to its usual spot, half a car length off from the painted lines, as if she was in too much of a hurry to care or too tired to try. When he finally emerged from under the lifted truck, she was already standing by the front bumper of her car, head down, arms crossed against the wind. It wasn't cold, not really, but she was shaking like it was. He wiped his hands, grabbed his toolkit, and walked over. "Same issue?" She nodded once. Her gaze didn't meet his. Something about her was different this time. Off. Mason opened the hood and leaned in, pretending to focus on the engine, though his mind kept drifting back to her. Her gloves were gone. Her bare hands were red from the cold, fingers raw and calloused. Not the kind of hands that came from occasional chores. These were the hands of someone doing hard labor, someone who worked too many shifts and got paid too little for all of them. He noticed the smudges under her eyes, too. Not makeup, not dirt, just worn out, like she'd been crying but ran out of tears halfway through. "You been driving long?" he asked gently, not looking at her. She shrugged. "A while?" Her voice cracked on the second word. She caught it, swallowed it down, tried to stand straighter. "You eat anything today?" he asked, surprising himself. There was a pause. Then softly, "No." He nodded, closed the hood slowly. "Radiator's still leaking. I patched it again, but next time it might not hold." "I know," she whispered. She opened the car door but paused. Her voice came low, just above a whisper. "Thank you for not asking." Mason didn't answer, just gave a slow nod and watched her drive off into the night. He didn't know her name, but her silence said more than words ever could. And he had a feeling, whatever she was running from, it wasn't just a broken car. By the sixth Tuesday, it wasn't a coincidence anymore. It was routine. A strange, delicate ritual that neither of them spoke about, but both obeyed without question. She'd arrived just after the last customer left, always when the sun dipped low and the sky turned the color of bruised peaches. She'd pull in, pop the hood, and wait. No horn, no wave, no small talk. Mason would come out, wiping his hands on the same oil-stained rag, and get to work. She never asked what was wrong. He never explained what he fixed. Sometimes it was real work, leaking coolant, faulty alternator, misfiring spark plugs. Other times, he just cleaned the terminals or topped off the washer fluid, knowing full well there was nothing truly broken, but he worked anyway, just so she'd stay, just so she'd keep coming back. She never offered money, not once. And he never asked for it. It wasn't pride, it wasn't charity, it was something else. Something that hung in the air like smoke, unspoken and fragile. He had the feeling that if he so much as reached for a receipt pad, she'd disappear for good. She didn't linger. As soon as he was done, she'd nod, maybe whisper a soft "thank you," and drive off before the silence got too loud between them. It should have been awkward. It wasn't. It was understood. Once he thought about asking her name, just once, but the words stuck in his throat. It didn't feel right, like naming the moment would take something away from it. This wasn't friendship. It wasn't romance. It wasn't pity. It was something in between. A quiet kind of tether that neither of them tugged on too hard, afraid it would snap. He started keeping track in a worn notebook tucked behind the cash register. Not of her name, not of her address, but of the car's condition. What he did. What he noticed. Each note ended with the same word. No charge. Sometimes he wondered if she knew how much he looked forward to those visits, if she could see it in the way he worked slower than usual, in the way he lingered just a little too long after tightening the last bolt. And sometimes, late at night, when the lights were off and the tools were silent, he wondered what kind of world she was driving back into, and why, for some reason, she trusted him to be her one safe stop. By the 7th week, Mason wasn't the only one who noticed her. The guys at the shop had their own kind of rhythm, gruff jokes, shared lunches, and a habit of poking at anything that looked even slightly like a secret. And lately, every Tuesday around dusk, they'd start glancing at the clock, then at Mason, smirking behind their coffee cups or beneath lifted hoods. It was Jasper who broke first, leaned over the fender of an old Chevy, hands buried in the engine bay, and said loud enough for the others to hear, "Hey, Mason, you got a standing date we don't know about, or you just like working overtime for free?" The others laughed. Theo wheezed into his sleeve. Cal slapped a wrench against his palm. Mason didn't look up from the brake line he was tightening. "Just a regular," he muttered. "Oh, is that what we're calling it now?" Jasper said, wiping his hands and walking over. "Regular? Or the kind of regular that only shows up when the sun's down and your ears turn red?" "I fix her car," Mason said evenly. "That's it." "Yeah? And does she know that's all you're doing?" Theo chimed in, chuckling. Mason tightened the bolt harder than he needed to. "Don't you all have jobs to finish?" "Sure," Cal said, leaning on the tool cart. "But none as interesting as yours, Romeo." It wasn't mean-spirited, not really, but the words stuck anyway, like grit under a gasket. They didn't get it. They hadn't seen the way she stood there, stiff as iron, but one gust of wind away from breaking. They hadn't noticed the way she flinched at loud sounds, or how she always checked her rearview mirror before she got out of the car. She wasn't some fling, she wasn't anything, not in the way they meant. Still, Mason knew how it looked. A woman, no name, showing up like clockwork, him fixing her car without charging her, silence between them thicker than any conversation. He didn't bother trying to explain. There wasn't language for something like this. Whatever it was, it didn't fit in a joke or a tease or a story over beers, so he just kept working. And when the clock ticked toward closing, he found himself watching the lot again, waiting for that beat-up blue sedan to appear like it always did, and dreading the day it might not. Tuesday came the same way it always did, quiet, uneventful, wrapped in the smell of motor oil and the buzz of hydraulic lifts. The sky was a dull slate gray, the kind that made the whole world feel like it hadn't fully woken up. Rain was in the air, but it hadn't broken yet, just sat heavy, threatening. Mason kept glancing at the lot. By 6, Jasper had already clocked out. Theo followed with a mock salute and a wink. "Tell your girl we say hi," he joked, tossing his gloves into the bin. Mason gave a half smile, the kind you put on so no one asks more questions. He stayed behind under the pretense of finishing paperwork, but his hands never touched a pen. He just sat there, leaned on the workbench near the bay door, staring out into the open lot as if she might pull in at any second. She didn't. 7 rolled past, then 8. The wind picked up. A few stray leaves tumbled across the gravel, catching in the corners like secrets left behind. Mason walked out under the awning, rain finally starting to fall in thin sheets. Her usual spot, second from the right, just past the oil stains, sat empty, and it looked wrong that way, like something was missing from the picture. He told himself maybe her car finally gave out, maybe she found another garage, maybe she didn't need him anymore, but his gut said different. She would have come. Even if it wasn't the car, even if it was just a loose belt, or an excuse to sit in silence for a few minutes. She would have come. He stood out there until the rain soaked through his shirt, until the chill crept into his bones and settled somewhere behind his ribs. Still, he waited. And when he finally turned off the lights and locked the doors, it wasn't just disappointment sitting on his chest. It was something heavier. Worry. Not about the car, about her. Because as much as he didn't know her, not really, there was a quiet thread between them. And tonight, it had gone slack. And that scared him more than he was willing to admit. Wednesday morning, Mason woke up with a weight in his chest he couldn't explain. He told himself to shake it off, that it was just another missed appointment, nothing more. But the longer he stood under the too-hot shower, the louder the silence felt. She had never been late, never skipped, not once in almost 2 months. He drank his coffee without tasting it, left his breakfast untouched. His boots felt heavier as he stepped outside, gravel crunching beneath him like broken glass. By noon, the shop was buzzing with the usual noise, laughter, metal clinks, the clatter of dropped tools. But Mason's mind wasn't in it. He kept checking the clock, kept glancing toward the lot, like maybe he'd gotten the day wrong, maybe she'd come late, maybe something came up and she'd swing by today instead. But she didn't. At lunch, instead of grabbing a sandwich, he grabbed his keys. "You heading out?" Cal asked from beneath a lifted SUV. "Be back in a bit," Mason said, voice tighter than he meant. He drove the route she always took, out past the diner with the flickering neon sign, past the church that sat empty on weekdays, past the gas station where he once saw her filling up with quarters from a coin purse. It was a quiet stretch of road, flanked by fields going to seed and mailboxes leaning on rusted posts. He looked for the blue sedan, nothing. No tire marks, no signs of an accident, just road and sky and the gnawing feeling that something wasn't right. He stopped at the diner and asked the waitress, the older one with the kind eyes, if she'd seen a woman with a beat-up car, dark hair, always looking like she hadn't slept. The woman blinked, shook her head slowly. "Can't say I have lately." Mason nodded, muttered a thank you, and left without finishing his coffee. Back at the shop, he worked with more force than precision. Every bolt tightened a little too hard. Every wrench clanged louder than necessary. He didn't talk much the rest of the day. Something was wrong. He didn't have proof. But some part of him, the same part that knew engines by sound and leaks by scent, knew it in his gut. And that kind of knowing was never wrong. The next Tuesday came with the kind of wind that whispered warnings through the gaps in the garage doors. Rain had dried into dust again, and the clouds above rolled like they were arguing about whether or not to cry. Inside the shop, the air was thick with oil, exhaust, and something else Mason couldn't name. Something that pulled tighter with every hour that passed. He didn't say much that day, just kept busy. Replaced a starter that didn't need replacing. Checked a transmission twice, even though it shifted clean. The others noticed, but none of them asked. Not this time. Even Jasper, normally quick with a jab, kept his distance. 6 o'clock rolled around. The last customer waved goodbye, and the shop quieted. Mason turned off the radio, wiped his hands on a rag, and walked to the edge of the bay, leaning against the frame like he always did when he was waiting for her. The spot, third from the edge, just behind the drain line, stared back at him, empty. It shouldn't have meant anything. People miss things. Life gets in the way. Cars break beyond repair. But Mason couldn't ignore the shape of the space. How it looked wrong, out of place, like someone had taken a painting off the wall and left behind a blank square. That was her spot. Not officially, not marked. But it was hers. Just like the silence that came with her. Just like the small things she left behind. Half-drunk coffee cups, receipts crumpled in the glove box, the faint scent of lavender clinging to her seat. Now it sat there like a question no one was answering. Mason stood there long after the shop lights flicked off on their own. The others had gone home. Even the street outside had fallen quiet. But he stayed, eyes fixed on the space where her sedan used to idle, steam curling from under the hood while she stood nearby, arms folded like armor. He ran a hand through his hair, jaw tight. He didn't know her name, didn't know where she lived, didn't know who or what she was running from. But the absence of her silence, her presence, even her problems, was louder than any noise he'd heard in months. And it was starting to hollow him out from the inside. Mason started coming in earlier. hours before the others, while the sky was still the color of ash and the morning mist clung to the windows like breath. He'd unlock the front, flip the lights on, and dive into repairs like he was racing a clock no one else could see. He told himself it was to get ahead on backlogged work, that the extra labor meant fewer worries at night, but the truth sank deeper than that. He was trying to outpace the silence. He cleaned the bay she used to park in, twice, scrubbed the oil stains beneath where her tires had rested, organized the tools on the nearby bench even though no one touched them but him. He found one of her coffee cups in the bin, paper, bent at the rim, still faintly smelling of hazelnut, and he nearly threw it out, but his hand stopped halfway to the trash. He stared at it, lips tightening, then folded it carefully and tucked it into the back of a drawer he rarely opened. The others noticed his shift. They stopped teasing, stopped asking. Jasper once caught him replacing a perfectly good belt, just watched him for a second, then walked away without a word. Even Theo, who joked about everything, left him alone when he stayed late, fixing a car no one had dropped off. But the truth was, the work wasn't enough. The hum of engines, the clatter of tools, the grease under his nails, it had always been enough to drown out the world. Until now. Now, every clang echoed too loud. Every hour dragged longer than it should. The absence of her car, her silence, her weight in the air, had become something he carried with him, like a shadow stitched to his back. He caught himself looking out the front window too often, listening for the rattle of her engine, watching headlights pass by, hoping one of them would flicker blue, stall at the gate, and bring her back like nothing had changed. But she didn't come, and even with all the noise of the garage around him, Mason had never felt the place so quiet. It had been a Tuesday like any other. She arrived with her usual quiet, the blue sedan hiccuping into the lot just before sunset. The engine light was on again. Mason had already known she was coming. He'd felt it in his chest the way some people feel weather shifting in their bones. She parked, stepped out without a word yet, and leaned against the fender while he worked. She didn't say much that day, not that she ever did, but something in her posture seemed different, softer around the edges, less braced. She looked down a lot, at her boots, at the gravel, at her hands folded tightly in her lap, like they were holding something back. The fix was minor, a loose wire. 5 minutes of work, maybe 10 if you dragged it out. Mason dragged it out. When he closed the hood, she was already standing near the driver's door, her hand gripping the handle like it was the only thing keeping her grounded. But then she turned, reached into the passenger seat, and came back holding something, a crumpled napkin, folded once. She held it out to him, not with ceremony, not with fanfare, just an offering, tentative and awkward. "I didn't know what else to do," she said. "But thank you for not making me feel like a burden." Then she got in the car and drove off. Mason stood there for a long time, napkin in hand. It was the kind of cheap paper you get from a gas station deli, smudged at the corners, the ink faint. But the words were still clear, even now. "Thank you for your kindness." That was all. He didn't show it to anyone, didn't mention it to the guys. He just folded it neatly and slipped it into the breast pocket of his work shirt. That night, he transferred it to his wallet. It stayed there, tucked behind his license, and an old photo of his dad's first truck. He read it sometimes, not often, just when the days got too quiet or when her parking spot sat untouched and the silence pressed too hard against his ribs. It wasn't much, just ink on paper, but it was the only thing she'd left behind. And somehow, it felt like the only proof he hadn't imagined her. The rain came in hard that night, thick sheets of it pounding the asphalt, blurring the edges of the world through the shop windows. The kind of downpour that made even the most reliable engine stall and turned gravel lots into shallow lakes. Most of the guys had left early, said there was nothing left to do, nothing worth waiting around for. Mason had nodded, offered a half-hearted wave, but stayed behind like always. He told himself he was organizing parts inventory, but the truth was he hadn't touched the shelves in over an hour. He stood by the front bay, lights dimmed, leaning against the frame of the open garage door. The wind whipped water across the concrete floor in thin ribbons. His jacket was zipped halfway, collar turned up against the cold, but he didn't feel it. Not really. His eyes kept drifting to the road, to the corner where her headlights used to appear, flickering just before the car rolled into view. But there was nothing, just rain and the hum of distant tires on soaked pavement. He checked his watch, 8:17 p.m. She was never this late. When she came before the sun dipped too far. She never liked the dark. He remembered that now, the way her eyes flicked around the lot, always checking shadows, the way her hand trembled once when she dropped her keys and looked up like someone might be watching. He reached into his pocket, pulled out the napkin again. The edges were frayed now, the creases soft from too many folds. He read the words, not because he didn't know them, but because he needed to believe someone had actually written them. The rain intensified, drumming louder against the tin awning above him. Mason didn't move. The streetlights reflected off the puddles, casting long silver veins across the wet gravel, like something alive was crawling through the lot. He waited. And when the clock struck 9, he was still there, hands deep in his jacket pockets, jaw clenched tight against the cold. There was no blue sedan, no flicker of headlights, only the rain, and the ache of not knowing if he'd ever see her again. It was a Thursday when it happened. The sun was high and sharp, cutting through the haze like it had something to prove. Mason was under the hood of a rusted-out Ford when he heard the crunch of gravel in the lot, tires pulling into a familiar rhythm, the kind of rhythm his body had memorized. He wiped his hands, heart skipping for just a second. But it wasn't her. It was a newer model, sleek, silver, still had the dealer tags hanging from the mirror. A kid stepped out, couldn't have been older than 22, ball cap backward, Bluetooth in his ear, and the kind of swagger that hadn't earned its place yet. He slammed the door, pulled out his phone, and leaned against the hood like he owned the place. And he'd parked in her spot. Mason's chest tightened. It didn't make sense. Logically, it didn't matter. It was a parking space, concrete and oil stains. But watching that car sit there, watching someone else fill that space, stirred something sharp and bitter in him. Like watching someone else sit in a pew at a funeral. Like watching a stranger pick up a photo that wasn't theirs. He walked over slowly, wiping grease from his hands, his eyes locked on the silver sedan like it had done something personal. "Hey," Mason called. The kid looked up, distracted. "Yeah? You can't park there." The kid blinked, confused. "It's a parking spot, man." "Not that one," Mason said, his voice firmer now. "Move it." The kid straightened, scoffing. "Seriously?" Mason didn't blink. "Seriously." There was a pause. Then the kid rolled his eyes, climbed back into the car, and peeled out with a huff of exhaust and attitude. Mason didn't care. He watched until the space was empty again. Then he stood there for a while, just staring at it, the cracked pavement, the tire tracks, the quiet. She hadn't come in 2 weeks. No word, no message, nothing. But that space was still hers. As long as Mason had anything to say about it, that it would stay that way. Some things didn't need names to be sacred. It was a Tuesday, exactly 4 weeks since the last time Mason had seen her. 31 days, not that he was counting. The ache had settled into something dull and constant, like an old injury that flared up whenever it rained. The guys had stopped asking. The teasing had faded. Even the napkin in his wallet, once smoothed over and reread like scripture, had started to wear at the edges, ink bleeding into the fold. He had just shut down the air compressor when he heard it. A sputter, a cough. That offbeat rattle he'd come to recognize like a second heartbeat. Not a regular engine. Hers. He froze. The sound grew closer, hesitating at the edge of the lot before finally rolling into view. Same blue sedan, same cracked headlight, and rust along the bottom of the driver's side door. But this time, it moved slower, weaker, like the car was holding its breath. She pulled into her old spot, but not with her usual precision. The tires scraped the curb. The engine stuttered, then gave a final sigh and died completely. The headlights blinked twice before going dark. Mason was already halfway across the shop, wiping his hands on the same rag he always seemed to carry, his heart pounding like it had forgotten how to pace itself. She stepped out. But something was different. The coat she wore hung looser, her face was thinner, her eyes, they looked older. Like time had passed faster for her than for the rest of the world. She didn't look up right away, just stood there, hand still on the door, like she wasn't sure she'd really made it. Mason didn't speak, not yet. He let her come to him, let the silence stretch between them the way it always had. Only now it wasn't soft, it was brittle, breakable. She finally looked up. "I didn't know where else to go," she said. Her voice cracked at the edges, and for the first time since the ritual had begun, Mason didn't look at the car. He looked at her, and he saw it. The quiet storm behind her eyes, and the fact that she hadn't just come back. She had come back broken. The blue sedan sat there like a wounded animal, steam rising in lazy curls from beneath the hood. Mason didn't move at first. His eyes swept over it, slow and careful, the way someone might look at a home after a fire, searching for what was lost, what had survived. Then he saw it. The passenger seat was empty, no car seat. It had always been there before, nestled snugly in the front, like it didn't belong anywhere else. Faded blue fabric, a crooked buckle, and once, a small pink sock caught in the crevice between the seat and the console. He'd never asked about it, never brought it up. But he remembered the way she used to glance at it sometimes while he worked, like she was somewhere else for a moment, somewhere softer. Now it was gone. His throat tightened. He swallowed hard and walked toward the car, boots crunching against wet gravel. She was standing beside the driver's door, arms wrapped tightly around herself, gaze unfocused. Her lips parted like she wanted to speak, but the words wouldn't come. He glanced back at the interior. The space where the car seat used to be looked larger now, emptier, like something had been ripped out, not just removed. "I tightened the mount on that seat once," he said quietly, nodding toward the cabin. "Didn't tell you, just noticed it was loose." She didn't answer. He waited. Then she exhaled, a sound too sharp, too full of things unspoken. "She's with my sister now," she said, her voice barely holding together. "Out of town." Mason didn't ask why. Didn't need to. The absence in her voice told him more than the sentence did. And the way her shoulders curled inward, like she was trying to make herself smaller, like she was ashamed of something she never should have had to carry alone. He looked at her, not the way someone looks at a customer or even a friend, but like a man seeing someone on the edge, teetering. "You want me to look at the car?" he asked gently. She blinked back whatever emotion threatened to rise and nodded. "Yeah," she said. "Please." But neither of them were talking about the engine. He was elbow deep under her hood again, sleeves rolled up, fingers blackened with grease and road grime. The engine was running hot again. Hose clamps loose, radiator cap hanging by a thread, Band-Aid fixes on a car that had been begging for mercy for years. Mason worked quietly, the way he always did with her. Calm, steady, no questions. She stood near the front bumper this time, instead of the curb, closer than usual, watching him. Arms still folded, but there was something restless about her, like she was trying to keep her hands from shaking. He didn't speak. And then, for the first time, she did. "I used to be a nurse," she said. Mason's hands froze, socket wrench suspended in midair. He looked up, but she wasn't looking at him. Her eyes were fixed on the far end of the shop, on a dark corner that held nothing but a stack of unused tires. "Pediatric ward," she continued, voice rough but steady. 5 years, before everything, before her. He didn't say a word, just slowly lowered the wrench, wiped his hand on a rag, and leaned against the frame of the car, not pushing her, just listening. "She got sick fast," she said. "One of those viruses that the doctors say usually passes in a week, but it didn't. And I missed too many shifts, lost the job, then the apartment. Then the car almost went too, but I needed it for the clinic, so I kept driving it, even when I couldn't afford the repairs." Her voice wavered. She took a breath like she'd been underwater. "I used to hate coming here," she admitted. "Hated that you'd see me like that, like someone who didn't have it together. But then, every week, you fixed something without asking, without making me feel small." She turned her eyes to him now, and they were glassy, full of a quiet storm that had lived behind them for too long. "I never said thank you. Not really. I should have." Mason's throat tightened. He didn't know what to say, so he just nodded, slow and sure. "You didn't have to," he said softly. But part of him was glad she finally did. The shop was quiet again, that kind of rare quiet that only came after the tools stopped clanging and the hum of engines faded into memory. Just the occasional drip of water hitting the concrete and the low rustle of wind pressing against the windows. Mason stood beside her car, wiping his hands on a rag, the scent of coolant and metal still clinging to the air. She hadn't left yet. Usually by now she'd be behind the wheel, muttering a soft thank you before disappearing into the dark. But tonight she lingered. Her fingers grazed the hood, tracing a thin line of dust with the edge of her nail. He waited. She spoke without looking at him. "Tuesdays were the only days he didn't know where I'd be." Mason's hand stilled mid-wipe. "My daughter's father," she said, her voice low but clear. He's not in the picture. Not now. But he was around. Too much. Always watching. Always angry." Mason set the rag down. His body didn't move otherwise. He didn't breathe too loud, didn't shift his stance, just gave her space. "He didn't know about this place," she continued. "Didn't care where I went as long as I brought the car back, and didn't speak out of turn. So I started coming here. Said the car needed looking at. Every week. And I kept hoping it would break just enough to give me a reason." Her voice cracked then. She blinked fast, refusing to let the tears fall. "I wasn't just trying to get my car fixed," she said. "I was trying to breathe, just for an hour. In a place where no one yelled, no one grabbed my wrist too tight, no one asked what I did wrong." She looked at him, eyes red-rimmed and raw. "You made it quiet here, safe." Mason's chest tightened. He hadn't known, not all of it. He'd felt pieces. The way she flinched at loud noises, the way she avoided mirrors. But hearing it, spoken aloud, like confession, it twisted something in him. "You were never a burden," he said quietly. "Not for 1 second." She nodded, one tear slipping past despite herself. "I know," she whispered. "That's why I kept coming." The silence after her confession stretched long and heavy between them. Mason didn't try to fill it. He just stood there, eyes steady on hers, grounding her in that moment like he had all the others, without pressure, without judgment, just quiet understanding. And maybe that's why she kept going. "I didn't mean to vanish," she said after a while so, voice rough from disuse, like it had taken too much out of her just to speak that sentence. "I should have said something. I know that. But I didn't have the words, not then." She stepped away from the car, wrapping her arms around herself as if bracing for some kind of invisible wind. "My mom collapsed in her apartment," she said. "It was sudden. 1 minute we were arguing on the phone, the next I was getting a call from her neighbor saying the ambulance was on its way." Mason's jaw clenched. He didn't interrupt. "She's got this heart condition. Something she didn't even know about until it almost killed her. They kept her in ICU for 10 days. I stayed with her the whole time, slept in that plastic chair by her bed, scared to close my eyes in case she didn't open hers again." Her voice broke then, not loud, not dramatic, just a small splintered crack down the middle. "I didn't have time to think about the car, or you, or Tuesdays. Everything else just fell away." Mason took a slow breath. The image of her, hunched in some sterile hospital room under harsh fluorescent lights, curled up next to a beeping monitor with no one else to lean on, it sat in his chest like a weight. "She's okay now," she said quickly, almost too quickly. "Stubborn as ever. The doctor said she was lucky. I think she'd call it something else." She finally looked at him again. "I didn't come back because the car broke down, Mason. I came back because I needed to see something that hadn't fallen apart." He didn't speak right away, just nodded, slow and steady. "Well," he said softly, "you picked the right place." And she did what he hadn't seen her do in weeks. She smiled, just a little. But it was real. She reached into her coat pocket with a hesitation that made Mason's gut twist. Not like she was unsure of what she was doing, more like it mattered too much. Her fingers fumbled for a second, then emerged holding a small, crumpled envelope, cream-colored, soft at the edges, like it had been folded and refolded a dozen times. She looked at it, then up at him, then back at it. "I was going to mail this," she said, voice low, almost embarrassed. "But I couldn't figure out how to send something to a man who doesn't have a mailbox listed anywhere." Mason offered a faint smile, but didn't say anything. He just held out his hand. She placed it in his palm like it was fragile, like it might fall apart if handled too roughly. He unfolded the flap slowly, carefully, and let the contents slide out into his hand. A stack of old gas station receipts, some scribbled on with ballpoint pen. One had a crooked smiley face. Another, just the word "thanks" in shaky cursive. A third had half a sentence. "I was going to say something today, but..." And then nothing. Tucked between them was a strip of notebook paper torn at the edge with a little girl's drawing. Stick figures. A crooked blue car. A man with big hands and a wrench. A woman with brown hair and what looked like a little heart floating above her head. And finally, at the bottom of the envelope, a bracelet. Woven, handmade, the kind you make with embroidery thread and patience, faded red and black, knotted unevenly, one end frayed like it had been worn and unworn too many times. "I made that when I was in the hospital," she said. "Between crying and not sleeping. I know it's nothing fancy. I wanted you to know that it meant something, everything you did." Mason held the bracelet for a long moment. His hands, so used to steel and rubber, felt clumsy now. He ran his thumb across the knots, tracing every imperfect line. "It's more than enough," he said quietly. "Because in a life full of invoices and broken engines, this was the kind of thing you didn't throw away. This was the kind of thing you kept." The sun was dipping low when she asked. Mason was wiping down the last of his tools, the shop quiet except for the soft hum of a heater that barely worked and the occasional creak of cooling metal. She lingered near the bay door, arms folded, her eyes bouncing between the floor and the fading light outside. There was something in her stance, nervous but not uncertain. "Do you drink coffee after 6?" she asked suddenly. Mason looked up, caught off guard. He paused, then shrugged. "Sure, sometimes." "Want to make it one of those times?" she asked. "There's a place near the park. It's quiet." He didn't need time to think. He just nodded, grabbed his coat, and followed her out. They didn't talk much on the drive, but it wasn't awkward. It was the kind of silence that didn't demand to be broken. She parked near the edge of the park, the headlights casting long shadows over the leaf-covered path. The coffee shop was one of those half-forgotten places, wooden chairs, chipped mugs, and the smell of something warm baking in the back. They took their drinks to go and walked along the trail, the night cool but not cold, the kind of weather that made you breathe a little deeper. The path was mostly empty, a couple walking a dog, a jogger with headphones. Otherwise, it felt like the world had stepped aside to give them space. She sipped from her cup, then said, "I haven't walked like this in a while, not without checking over my shoulder." Mason didn't respond right away, just let her words sit. "It's strange," she continued, "how safety doesn't come from locks or cameras. Sometimes it's just a person." He glanced at her, the streetlights catching the curve of her cheek, the shadows beneath her eyes. "You're not the same as when I first met you," he said. "No," she replied. "I'm not. I was surviving then. Now, I think I'm learning how to live." They walked in silence for a while after that. side by side, step by step, and for once, neither of them felt the need to be anywhere else. They found a bench beneath an old oak tree, its bare limbs stretching out like bones against the night sky. The coffee in Mason's cup had gone cold, but he held it anyway, letting the weight of it fill the silence between them. She sat beside him, legs pulled up, one hand wrapped around her own cup, the other fiddling with the bracelet she'd given him. She hadn't said much since they sat down, but her eyes kept drifting toward him like she was working up the nerve to hand him something heavier than words. When she finally spoke, it was barely above a whisper. "I used to think people were good by default," she said. "That if you gave them a chance, they'd show you their best. But after a while, after enough times getting used, hurt, ignored, you start to believe maybe you're the problem." Mason didn't look at her, not yet. He just listened. "I stopped asking for help," she continued, "stopped expecting kindness. Figured that way I wouldn't be disappointed. And then one day, I show up at a garage with a dying car and a dying spirit, and there's a man who doesn't flinch when I don't smile, doesn't pry when I don't talk, just helps." Her voice caught. She paused, let out a shaky breath, then went on. "You didn't try to fix me. You didn't even act like you saw I was broken. And maybe that's what I needed most, someone who treated me like I still worked." Mason turned then, just slightly. His gaze met hers. "I fix cars," he said, his voice soft but sure. "But I pay attention to people. Doesn't mean I know how to save 'em, just means I see 'em." She looked down at her hands, then back at him. "You reminded me that kindness doesn't always come with strings. That sometimes it just shows up, quiet and steady, like an old truck that still runs when everything else has failed." He didn't know what to say to that, didn't know if there was anything to say, so he reached over, slow and certain, and gently covered her hand with his. And for a long moment neither of them said a word. The park had quieted. Even the wind seemed to hush, as if listening in. Streetlights hummed overhead, casting a soft yellow glow across the bench where they sat, her coffee now untouched and cooling on the ground beside her boot. Mason's hand still rested over hers, steady and warm, but not possessive, just present. And maybe that's why she finally said what had been pressing against the back of her throat for years. "I'm not broken," she said. Her voice was firmer this time, not loud, but laced with something hard-earned. Mason didn't flinch or withdraw. He just nodded slightly, like he'd already known that. She pulled her hand back gently and straightened up, brushing the hair out of her face. Her jaw was tight, but her eyes were steady. "People keep looking at me like I'm some kind of shattered glass," she said. "Like I need to be pieced back together before I can be loved, before I can belong again. But I'm not broken. I've been tired, I've been scared, I've been quiet, but that's not the same thing." Mason let the silence hang, respectful. He could feel her unraveling, not in a way that meant falling apart, but in a way that meant finally peeling off the armor. "I don't need someone to fix me," she continued. "I need someone who sees I've been trying to fix myself for a long damn time, and maybe just stands beside me while I do it." She looked over at him then, her eyes glossy but defiant, waiting to see if he'd try to correct her, offer sympathy, or worse, pity. But Mason didn't offer any of those things. Instead, he leaned forward, elbows on his knees, hands clasped. "You're right," he said simply. "You don't need fixing. You just need someone who doesn't walk away when the engine misfires." She let out a small laugh. It surprised her, a breath of relief that felt like the first honest exhale in a long time. "I think I've spent so long trying to disappear," she said softly. "And then I walked into your shop, and for the first time I felt like someone actually saw me." Mason met her eyes. "I see you," he said. And she believed him. The air had turned cooler by the time they started walking back toward the lot. The night was still, save for the crunch of gravel beneath their boots and the occasional creak of trees swaying above. The coffee had long gone cold, but neither of them seemed to notice or care. They walked in step, saying nothing for a while, until Mason's voice broke through the quiet. It was low, almost like he was speaking to the dark more than to her. "My dad used to say the world doesn't owe you anything, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't give something to it anyway." She looked at him, but didn't interrupt. "He ran a shop like mine," Mason continued, "smaller, older, barely held together with anything but spit and prayer, but he kept it alive. People came from all over, not because he was the best mechanic, though he was, but because he never turned anyone away." His hands were in his jacket pockets now, shoulders slightly hunched, eyes fixed ahead. "I remember being a kid, watching him fix this old woman's car. Took him 3 hours, middle of July, no fan belt in stock. He made one out of a cut-up leather belt from his own closet. Wouldn't take a dime. Said, 'That lady's trying to get to her sister's hospice bed. You think I'm going to slow her down with an invoice?'" He smiled faintly at the memory, but it was tinged with something more complicated. "I used to ask him why he did that, why he gave so much to people who'd probably never come back. He said, 'You don't help people to get something. You help because maybe one day someone helped you when you needed it, and this is just the universe asking you to return the favor.'" Mason paused, glanced at her. "I guess I never really stopped listening to that." She studied him, really studied him. This man who had spent months fixing her car without a question, standing here under the dim wash of streetlight, telling her that maybe kindness didn't need a reason. Maybe it was the reason. "You're a rare kind of person, Mason," she said softly. He shook his head. "I'm just trying to be the kind of man my dad would have been proud of." And in that moment she saw it. The man behind the quiet. The boy who learned how to show up, even when no one asked. They stood by her car now, the engine finally cooled, the hood still up like a shield half lowered. The sky above was deep navy, stars poking through where the city lights couldn't drown them. Mason had closed the distance between them without meaning to. Maybe it was the walk, or the stories, or the way her voice had softened when she talked about wanting to be seen. Either way, they were closer now, not just in space, in something quieter. She leaned back against the fender, arms no longer folded, her defenses loosened like bolts finally given room to turn. He stood just a few feet away, hands in his pockets, rocking slightly on his heels, like a man trying not to say too much all at once. "You always this quiet?" she asked, her voice low, teasing but not mocking. "Only when I'm afraid of saying something that matters," Mason replied. She tilted her head, studying him. "And what is it you're afraid to say?" He looked at her then, really looked. The moonlight caught the shadows beneath her eyes, the faint scar near her collarbone, the way her breath caught slightly when the silence grew too still. "That I think about you," he said, "not just on Tuesdays. I've thought about you every damn day since the first time you pulled in here." The words hung there, exposed, vulnerable. She didn't look away, and instead she stepped forward just enough for the air to thin between them, just enough that he could smell the hint of lavender again, the same scent that used to linger in her car long after she drove away. His hand brushed hers. Not by accident. She didn't move. He leaned in, slowly, giving her time. Her eyes closed, her lips parted. They were a breath away from something that had been building for months, aching and patient and quiet. And then, just before it happened, she stepped back. Not far, just enough. "Not yet," she whispered. Her voice wasn't cold, it wasn't afraid, and it was honest. Mason nodded, though his chest ached with the weight of it. "Okay," he said. "I'll wait." And in that moment, it meant more than if she had kissed him, because she trusted him enough to be honest, and he cared enough not to push. Some things, after all, are worth waiting for. The last Tuesday came with sunshine, not the hesitant kind that slipped through clouds like it was asking permission. This was full, bright, unapologetic light, the kind that warmed the metal on Mason's tools and painted the garage floor in golden rectangles through the open bay doors. It should have felt like a good day. Maybe it was. But Mason couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, something he couldn't name. He was mid-task, elbow-deep in the undercarriage of a Chevy that hadn't seen a proper oil change in years when he heard it. Not the stuttered wheeze of an engine on its last leg, no rattle, no steam. Just the smooth, steady purr of a car that didn't need fixing. He wiped his hands on his rag and stepped outside, blinking against the sun. There she was. The blue sedan rolled into the lot, clean this time, washed and shining, like someone had finally cared enough to tend to it. It parked with precision, engine shutting off in one confident breath. No cough, no struggle. She stepped out, wearing a soft green coat and her hair down, like she hadn't had to run from anything that morning. There was something different in the way she moved, lighter, more certain, and she wasn't alone. A girl slid out from the passenger side, small, maybe 6. Brown curls tied in a loose ponytail, arms wrapped around a stuffed bear whose fur had seen better days. The girl blinked up at the garage, wide-eyed, curious, not scared. Mason froze. She noticed. Walked around the car slowly, her daughter trailing close behind. There was no apology in her eyes, just quiet expectation. "I didn't come for the car," she said, stopping in front of him. He looked past her for a moment. The empty hood, the girl watching him carefully from behind her mother's legs, then back at the woman who'd once only spoken in nods and whispers. "No trouble today?" he asked, voice low. She smiled, soft and real. "Not with the car." And somehow that single line held everything they hadn't said yet. Mason nodded once, slow. So this wasn't about repairs anymore. It was about something else entirely. It was almost closing time when Mason saw the sedan again. He was wiping down the shop counter, half-focused, thinking more about dinner than the day's repairs. The radio hummed low in the background, some bluesy tune about lost love and rusted roads. Outside the wind had settled and the sun cast its final gold streaks across the lot like it was reluctant to leave. Then headlights flashed once across the bay window, and Mason looked up. The blue sedan pulled in slowly, tires crunching over familiar gravel. But it wasn't the car that made him still. It was her. She stepped out carefully, like she was holding something breakable inside her. Long coat, black, cinched at the waist, dress shoes with a heel, the kind that didn't belong in a garage. Her hair was pinned back, not messy like the days she used to arrive with stress in her eyes and sleep still clinging to her. She looked like she was coming from somewhere important, or going to somewhere even more so, and she was nervous. He could see it in the way her hands tugged at the sleeves of her coat, in the way she shifted her weight from foot to foot. She didn't walk toward the hood this time. She walked toward him. Mason met her halfway, wiping his hands on a clean rag, trying to ignore the sudden tightness in his chest. She wasn't broken anymore. That was clear. She didn't look like someone hiding from her past or trying to survive the next hour. She looked like someone who had made a decision, but that nervousness, it hadn't left her. She opened her mouth, closed it, looked down at her hands. He waited. Finally, she let out a breath. "I wasn't sure if this was a good idea." Mason raised an eyebrow. "Showing up in shoes like that? Bold choice for a garage." She laughed, small and shaky but real. "You always do that." "What?" "Make it easier to breathe." He didn't answer, just stood there, watching her carefully, because something was different this time. And whatever she was about to say, he had the feeling it would change everything. She stood in front of him, framed by the soft amber glow spilling from the garage and the last light of the day slipping beneath the skyline. Mason could hear the tick of her car's cooling engine behind her, smell the faint trace of lavender perfume and autumn air. But it was the look in her eyes that rooted him to the spot, open, fragile, determined. She took one careful step closer, coat rustling around her knees. "I'm not here for a fix," she said. Her voice didn't waver this time. It landed heavy and sure between them, and it stopped his breath like a tool dropping on concrete. He blinked. No? She shook her head slowly. The car's fine. Everything's fine. Mason looked past her at the car sitting neat in the spot that had belonged to her for months, the same spot he'd kept empty every Tuesday like it was sacred ground. He turned back to her, searching her face. So what brings you here? She hesitated, eyes dropping to her hands for a beat before lifting again. You do, she said. It was that simple and that terrifying. I thought about waiting longer, she admitted, her fingers toying with the edge of her coat pocket, giving it more time, making sure I was ready. But then I realized, if I wait until I'm not scared, I'll never show up. Mason's hands were still stained with oil, and he tucked them into his jacket, grounding himself. He could feel something shifting in the air between them, like all the quiet Tuesdays, the unfinished conversations, the unspoken feelings, had led right here, right now. She stepped closer again, now only a breath away. I don't need you to fix anything, she said. I just want to know if there's space in your life for someone who finally wants to stay. Mason didn't speak right away. His chest felt full, stretched with something deep and warm that had no name yet. He looked at her, at the woman who once arrived in silence and smoke, and saw her standing steady now, choosing not to run. He exhaled, slow and sure. There always was, he said. You just hadn't asked yet. She reached into her coat pocket with the same trembling carefulness she used to have when handing him her keys, like the smallest movement might break the moment open too fast. Her fingers wrapped around something small, something solid, and when she pulled it out, Mason saw the worn velvet of an old jewelry box resting in her palm. She didn't look at him right away. I found this at a pawn shop in Denver, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. 2 weeks after I started sleeping through the night again. It was tucked behind a bunch of fake gold and tangled necklaces, covered in dust like it had been waiting a while. Her thumb brushed the lid like she was still unsure if it was too soon or too much. I wasn't looking for it, she said, but the second I opened it, I thought about you. Mason's chest tightened, heart thudding against his ribs like it wanted out. She opened the box. Inside was a ring, small, vintage, nothing flashy. The diamond wasn't huge, but it caught the light in a quiet, knowing way, like it didn't need to shout to be beautiful. But that wasn't what stopped his breath. It was the charm. Just beside the stone, strung onto the band like an afterthought, was a tiny silver wrench, detailed, delicate, like someone had known exactly who it was for. Her eyes lifted to meet his then. She didn't smile, didn't cry, just looked at him like she'd spent months learning how to stand still in her own skin and had finally arrived. I don't expect anything, she said. No answers tonight, no promises. But I needed to give this to you because you fixed more than my car, and I needed you to know that. She held out the box, hand steady now. Mason didn't take it at first. He just stared at it, then at her, then back at the way the charm moved when the wind caught it, swinging, soft, like a pendulum counting down towards something inevitable. When he finally reached for it, his hands were shaking. But for the first time in a long time, he wasn't afraid. The garage smelled like old rubber, diesel, and something sweeter. Maybe it was the coffee he never finished, or maybe it was the scent she always seemed to carry with her, soft and stubborn. The overhead lights buzzed faintly, casting a warm golden hue across the floor. The silence between them wasn't empty. It pulsed, lived. She stood in the middle of Bay 2, the place where it all started, where she used to park crooked, headlights dim, engine wheezing like it was holding its last breath. The place where he never asked questions, just opened the hood and gave her space to exist without explanation. Now there was no broken car, no steam, no panic in her eyes, just her and the small, open box in her hand. Mason didn't speak. He wasn't sure he could. She looked around for a moment almost shyly, like she was taking it all in, the oil-stained concrete, the scratched, red toolbox, the faded photo of his father still pinned to the corkboard near the clock. She took a breath and turned back to him. I thought about doing this somewhere prettier, she said. A restaurant, a lake, somewhere normal, somewhere quiet. She gave a soft laugh, nervous and sincere. But the truth is, this is where I learned what love feels like. Mason's throat tightened. This is where I brought something broken and walked away with more than just a repaired engine, she continued. You didn't ask me to be anything. You didn't try to fix what wasn't yours. You just showed up, every time, with hands that knew how to hold heavy things without crushing them. She took a step closer. You once fixed my car, she said, her voice steady now, clear. Now I want to build a life with you. She held the box out again. Still, that quiet ring, with its tiny silver wrench, catching the light like a promise whispered instead of shouted. Mason looked down at it, then back at her. The woman who once only existed in his Tuesdays, who had turned grief into growth and fear into fire. He didn't smile, not yet. But his eyes said yes before his lips ever did.